understand this moment. I want to read you something. This was a quote in the New York Times from Jonathan Greenblatt, chief executive at the Anti-Defamation League. And he said this: social media companies have created, allowed, and enabled extremists to move their message from the margins to the mainstream. In the past, they couldn't find audiences for their position. Now, with a click or a post or a tweet, they can spread their ideas with a velocity we've never seen before.
Yep. So I think the thing that he's really right to point out, in my view, is that this ability for any random person really in the world to have their own channel to reach millions of people is totally unprecedented. And it's actually unprecedented not only technically speaking, but also really from like a regulatory and a legal point of view. If you look historically at America, a place that's always celebrated things like free speech, we've actually always thought about broadcasting really differently than we've thought about communication, right? And there's actually two different sort of frameworks. There's sort of the Telecommunications Act that said, hey, if you want to have a phone call with your friend, then you have an expectation of privacy. And actually, you can say pretty wild and outrageous things, but that's sort of your business. But if you want to broadcast those same outrageous or maybe not entirely accurate ideas to millions of people, you're held to a totally different standard. And broadcasters, I'm sure, as you know, because you're on television quite a bit, they're held to a different standard where you can and can't say certain things, you can and can't show certain things. And so I think we're in this weird moment in time where this behavior has been enabled technically, and the regulatory framework actually hasn't caught up to that reality.
Are you suggesting that we need more regulation in your world?
I think what I'm suggesting is we could actually learn a lot from how we've thought about broadcasting in the past and the responsibility of broadcasters. And I think historically we've just said that if you're going to reach a really wide audience and shape the minds and opinions of millions of people, then you do have a responsibility in terms of what you say.
But ultimately, that is a form of regulation, right? I mean, no. If you were a regulator today, if you were in the Trump administration and you wanted to deal with this, what would you do? What is the answer?
For us, I think the answer comes down to identifying really and labeling like what is broadcasting, because I think that is fundamentally the gray area today where we have the challenge. We understand what one-on-one communication is, but if you're let's say your Uncle Joe, for example, has some very extreme and maybe not so accurate views on the world, and he wants to reach 500 people, is that okay? If he wants to reach 50,000 people, is that okay? If he wants to reach 100,000, is that okay? Where do we draw the line in terms of where broadcasting is versus communication with friends?
But that's also the question, which is this whole idea of social media and the internet was supposed to democratize ideas, right? The idea was we were going to get everyone was going to have a voice that they didn't have. And it cuts both ways, because we had this panel just before with Lisa Borders and Padma on Time's Up and Me Too, and they would argue that the Me Too movement couldn't have happened without social media. And some people would argue that that was a very good thing. And then on the other end, there's this political discourse and other pieces of this that have become very complicated, and that's a bad thing. And so how should it work?
Well, I think there are many movements historically that have gotten a lot of traction without social media. So I'm not sure that the movements that we're seeing today, the response to a lot of the inequality that we're seeing in the world today, wouldn't be possible without social media. I think quite the contrary. I think a lot of those movements are really enabled by friends talking to friends, encouraging their friends to come out and make a difference. And I actually think one of the more dangerous things that I've seen is this idea that just using your voice is going to make a big difference, right? That's a piece of it, that's half of it, but the other half is really taking action to implement that change. And so I think today the movements you're seeing that are really successful are the ones that aren't just using their voice on social media, but are really deliberately taking action to make a difference in the world.
You haven't had these issues in the same way, and we'll talk about why on Snap, but what do you think about the kinds of things that you see on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter in this realm?
I don't see too much on Facebook because I'm not on there. I think the challenge really comes down to the way really that social networks evolved into social media. So if we remember, like, this is like 15 years ago now, maybe longer, social networks really came into being because the idea of connecting with people was a new idea, right? You went to college, you made great friends, and then you went off into the world and lived your life, and you lost touch with people. And so it was really exciting to go onto the internet and reconnect with them. And so social networks provided that value. But over time, what happened as smartphones got more and more popular and the internet, really became more like oxygen, right? It's everywhere. That value of reconnecting you with friends wasn't as valuable anymore because you never lost touch with them, right? You just talk to them on the phone all day long. You text message, et cetera. And so what happened was as that value in social networks started to decay and people stopped using social networks to communicate, how they felt or an update about their family, right? For a bunch of different reasons. They did it because the audience on social media was too big and it made them feel uncomfortable. They did it because it was permanent and that also made them feel uncomfortable. But what happened was over time, because there was that vacuum really of personal content and people trying to express themselves, that was filled with media. Right. And so social networks became a vehicle for distributing media, which was a big shift from why they were built in the first place.
Why has this issue not taken place in a meaningful way on Snap yet, you think?
How do you mean?
Meaning that I don't believe, and maybe you are policing it in some meaningful way, the issues that seem to be confronting Facebook, for example, or Twitter, for example, haven't yet jumped to your world. Am I wrong?
Well, I think it would be wrong to treat these problems as some sort of virus or disease, right? These problems are impacting these platforms because they have created an environment where that sort of behavior thrives, right? There's actually a higher propensity of negative content to be shared on these services because negative content has more engagement, right? And so I think you've actually ended up with systems that incentivize negative behavior. And I think if you look at Snap and how we've really thought about content, right, what we identified was that while this shift from social networks to social media was really, really powerful, and the idea of friends organizing content for you was really powerful, it was the first time the internet was personalized, right? Your friends created the newspaper for you every day instead of an editor. What we found was that with the rise of machine learning, computers are actually better at personalizing content for you than your friends. And so if you devise, for example, I think someone who's done this really well is Netflix. If you can define a pool of content that's high quality enough, right, that computers can then rank that content, you can end up with a personalized content experience that doesn't compromise integrity.
Right. Okay, I want to talk about Snap and the Snap business for a moment, because it was on a meteoric rise, I think it's fair to say, but I also think it's fair to say today it is challenged. There were times, and on this rise, by the way, where Facebook was trying to buy you for $3 billion, and then Google tried to buy you, I think, for $4 billion. There's a report that said Google tried to buy you later for $30 billion. Is that even true?
No comment on that.
No comment. Yeah. It might be true then. No, really. Do you want? Can you speak to that? Sundar's going to be here in a moment.
It might be better to ask him. I don't know.
I'll let you off there for a second. But let's talk about this. Snap's revenues were better recently than Wall Street had been hoping for, but the losses were lower than expected. But the data on the user base is shrinking. And the question is, what do you think has happened? Is that a product challenge? Is that a product problem? Is that a marketing problem? Is that a generational problem? What do you think has happened in terms of when you look at that number?
So it really, as we look at growth going forward, we're thinking about it really in two ways. So first of all, it's important to understand, like, our core is the 13 to 34 audience effectively in North America and Europe. And that's really our core community and user base where we've grown the service over the past 7 years. And so if we wanted to continue growing the service, we have to grow either in the developing world, right, outside of North America and Europe, where people predominantly use Android, or we have to continue aging up our user base, to be 34 plus, et cetera, in North America and Europe. And so we're thinking about those problems really differently. One of the things that's been a challenge for us for perhaps too long is Android. And Android for us really has been a difficult platform to develop for, and we thought that we could solve the problems we were seeing on Android incrementally. And it turned out about a year, maybe a little more than a year ago, we decided to completely rebuild Android from the ground up. So we're effectively doing 6-7 years of Android product development in 1 year to rebuild the product in a way so it can really perform for users that maybe don't have the top-end Android phones.
But for this to work and to continue to grow, how much of it is about, and by the way, there's some younger people here right in the corner, some students, but but how much of it is actually about getting all of us to use Snap in a way that maybe some people here don't?
I think that's a really big part of it, and I think that the first thing we have to do is help people understand the power of visual communication, right? I think a lot of people, when they think about like the most famous writers in the world, right? The best writers in the world can create an image in your mind. That's what makes them so good at what they do. And I think what we have to explain is what Snapchat does is actually you don't have to be the best writer in the world to create an image in your friend's mind. In one tap, you can share how you feel, what you're doing, who you're hanging out with, and I think that power in terms of visual communication is something that's just barely getting started.
You made a comment, and I assume this is what you're referring to on your conference call recently, where you talked about saying that Snap and the ability to see images was the quickest way to communicate. And a lot of people didn't understand what you were talking about. Is that what you mean, though?
Yeah, I think Snapchat's fast in a lot of different ways. So of course it's fast because it's visual, right? You could spend 30 minutes trying to describe this room, right. When in just one tap I can show my friends what it looks like. But also Snapchat's fast because it opens into the camera, right? And it's really this idea, we talked about social networks and social media. It's this idea of a social camera. And so if you open into the camera and in one tap you can express yourself and communicate with your friends, that for us is fundamentally faster and more powerful than text-based forms of communication.
Okay, so leadership question. You're managing this company. It's on this rise, this rocket ship, and yet the stock has started to fall, as you know. What has that done internally in terms of morale, in terms of your ability to retain and keep employees? What do you tell them? Because so many of them get cash comp, but the big pot of gold at the end is the stock.
Yep. So I think that's why it's so important to continue to communicate the long-term vision to our team. And I think that's what they're signed up for. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about Snap, and one of the reasons why people really work at Snap, is the importance of the mission. I think today it's more important than ever because people are looking externally. They're looking at what's happening in the world and the impact that technology is having on people's lives, and they're more inspired than ever to make a difference, right? Because we believe we can really make a positive impact on the world with Snap. So I think looking forward, obviously, it is critically important to increase internal communication, help people understand the vision and the plan to get there. But ultimately, people are at Snap because they really believe in what we're trying to do.
But just speak to this, because I think there is a morale issue in that there have been reports that say that there are people, of the 3,000 staffers, there was an internal report or internal survey that came out that said 40% of the 3,000 staffers said they would plan to leave the company at some point, and that's up from 11%. That's a tough challenge for you.
So that, unfortunately, I think was a misinterpreted study. That study is done by someone, or not someone, a company called Humu, which is a super cool company created by Laszlo, who ran people at Google. And they effectively run surveys across companies to sort of study the population. And that, I think, was referring to the retention index, which is really different than the number of people who are leaving Snap. So our attrition rate is, at industry averages. I think it's actually, to be honest with you, it was probably too low in the past. I think we're getting probably closer to. Yeah.
No, but but by the way, there are now headlines, lots of headlines about different people who have left in the senior ranks over the years. So you think that they should have left?
I think that our company has needed different leadership at different times. And I think that's normal for a company that's growing as fast as we have. I think there are lots of other companies that, after they go public or as they continue to scale, find that the team members, for example, who are, around the table in my dad's dining room, maybe can't run teams of 1,000 people or something like that. And I think everyone's happier to make sure that we find the right leadership.
Is there any part of you that ever said, kind of like Larry and Sergey at Google, you know what, we're young, we're inexperienced doing this, and we're going to bring in someone like an Eric Schmidt to sort of help us with this and be the quote-unquote adult in the room. I'm not suggesting you need adult supervision, but I'm curious if you ever said to yourself, you know what, I need to get much more senior people around me, or even perhaps hand it to people like that.
So I think what's been really exciting is we've been able to do that, but we've been able to do it as a team. I think the Google guys were so lucky, as you point out, to find someone like Eric. Like he's been a mentor of mine. I think he's like 1 in a billion. So if we found someone that extraordinary and that special, I think that would be a different conversation. But so far, what we've been able to do is recruit absolutely incredible people to work really as a team. And so I think, for example, we just hired Jeremy Gorman from Amazon. She ran their global ad sales team. She's extraordinary. We just hired Jared, who was the general counsel and ran corporate development at Spotify, and then went on to run news at Oath and be the CEO of HuffPo. So I think those are just recent examples. There's a bunch more of really experienced, really talented leaders that want to be part of a team, really focused on changing the world.
Can I ask one question, which was, there was a headline, for those of you who don't know, about somebody else that you had put originally in that role. This is Kristen O'Hara, where you had announced that they were going to be in that role, and then 2 weeks later, you switched that and gave the job to Gorman. Can you tell us what happened? I'm just curious from a management perspective, because people watched that, and I think people scratched their heads.
So I really think Kristen's extraordinary. She made a big impact in a really short amount of time at Snap, but ultimately, you know, I'm thrilled that Jeremy's joining us, and I think she brings just a wealth of experience leading sales organizations. So
was that hard for you, though, personally? I mean, no, that's a hard thing, because people are going to ask the questions as they do.
It's always really hard to make those sorts of decisions and to always put the business first. And I think when you do that, like, yes, it's super challenging, and that's why I think we're so fortunate to have mentors, to have great leaders on our team to support us.
Okay, a couple quick questions for me, and then I want to open up because I know there's lots of people who want to ask you questions. Privacy. You have access to huge amounts of data, location, information, all sorts of things. But unlike so many other companies, you haven't used it, or at least decided to use it yet, and now there are questions about privacy. And so the question is there a day and age where you think you can? And if you can't, what does that mean to the business? Because it means that there's less revenue available.
So I think you're right to point out that we don't collect data the way that other people do. And when we first talked about data minimization, people thought it was just for sexting, right? And now it's hilarious 7 years later to have like major governments around the world.
You call that sexting? Okay, yeah. I just want to make sure that everyone's awake. Yeah.
But 7 years later to have major governments around the world saying that data minimization is one of their top policy priorities, I think is a pretty dramatic shift over 7 years to really go from a world where people thought data minimization was about sexting to one where data minimization is really essential to personal freedom. And so I think as we look at data protection and privacy, for us, we really try to innovate there. And I can give you an example of actually a super cool technology we just developed recently. So we've been thinking a lot about personalization, as I mentioned, and machine learning is really core to that. And the way that machine learning works today is you run a model up in a server in the cloud, and you send tons of user data to that model, right? And you store all that user data, and the model evolves over time. And we said, what if we could build a model that was just as good, right, but do it in a way that protects user privacy? And so we actually developed a system where we have models in the cloud, but we actually pass the model down to the user. The user updates that model in an anonymized way and then passes the model back. And so you never have to send up that user data, you never have to store the user data, and you end up with a model that's just as effective. And so I think there are tons of opportunities here to really innovate, and I think now more than ever, people are understanding that privacy is absolutely critical to their freedom of thought, and yeah.
What is Snap 5 years from now? I mean, when you sort of think about, and I know you're a long-term thinker. I remember when we first met, this is now a long time ago, and you actually had a very interesting take on what Snap would look like. It actually does look like it today. So I want to know what Snap looks like 5 years from now.
5 years from now, I think people are going to start beginning to see how important the camera is as a tool in their lives. I think today people, predominantly with Snap, have shifted to understanding that the camera is not just a way to save memories, it's a way to communicate. But 5 years from now, I think people are going to be using the camera in ways that they can't even imagine today, and in a way that makes it as essential a tool as your phone is. And so I think that future, 5 years from now, I think will help set us up for a world that we see in a decade or two, where computing is actually overlaid on the world and not confined to a small screen on your phone.
Will Snap be an independent company?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Would you say, what would it take for you to sell the company?
I'd have to talk to Bobby about that one. I mean, I think for us.
Bobby's your co-founder.
Yeah. I think for us, we have a real belief in what we're trying to accomplish, and we believe that it's fundamentally different from what we're seeing in the world. And so, I think no matter what, we really just want to make sure that we can continue to make that vision real.
Okay, let's open it up. By the way, favorite filter?
The dog, obviously.
The dog, obviously. Okay. Thank you. We have a question right here in the front. Brian, let's get him a microphone if we can. Right here, dead center in the middle.
So recently, news has become a big part of the Snap platform, and I'm a big Snap user. I don't use the news feature that much, but I know a lot of people do. How do you and your company think about the way that your target demographic thinks about, consumes, wants, understands the news?
That's a great question. Thanks for using Snap. We appreciate it. I think for us, one of the most amazing things that we've seen is really the rise of the importance of mobile video, right? We call it stories on our service, but really how different that is from the way that news has been consumed in the past. So if you think about legacy technology like the television, you'd all have to gather as a family in one place at 6 p.m. to watch for an hour to learn about the world, right? And it's very clear that those days are just over, right? If you look at the 13 to 34 audience, on television, it's effectively off a cliff. This is the first year that television networks aren't guaranteeing that audience anymore for advertisers. And so we really are at a very interesting inflection point in terms of the way that people are consuming news, especially because you can choose any time to get updated on what's happening in the world. And what we've seen is actually with the evolution of our shows format, that the thing that's almost more important than full screen video on your phone is actually the narrative structure around it. Because today, in what would take 30 minutes on TV, you can grab in 3 minutes visually on Snap, and you can skip the parts you don't like. And so I think that on-demand nature and that narrative structure is really changing the way that people are consuming news.
Okay, let's take one more question. You look like you probably use Snap, so we're going to go to you.
So I've really been enjoying your new shows feature. What I was wondering is, what are you guys doing to make sure that the independent content creator can access, the Discover page of Snapchat and be able to get access to that?
Gosh, you should just always invite Snapchat users to these conferences. It's awesome. I think for us, influencers really fall in this sort of middle ground, right, between content that's made for your friends that's actually really intended for a small audience and the exclusive content like Snap Originals that lives on Snapchat. So those two types of content are really exclusive to our platform and why we've been investing a lot in both of those. And I think that middle ground influencer content, that content tends to seek a very large audience. So there's a lot of cross-posting in between, YouTube and Instagram and Snap. And so that content's inherently non-differentiated and therefore has been less of a focus of ours in the past. But what we have done that I think is really interesting is we've taken stars really that have been developed, cross-posting on all of these platforms, and we've helped build original content around them. So Endless Summer is a really good example. Summer McKeen is a YouTube star. She has a great channel, and now she has a show on Snap, and she's able to promote her show on Snap through YouTube. And so that for me is, I think, an example of how we're really empowering influencers who are really making unique content and have a unique story, and also allows us to deliver a differentiated content product.
Okay, final question from me. I think it's not unfair to say that Instagram did a pretty good job of aping a number of the features of Snap. What was the lesson of that as you watched that happen as a leader, an entrepreneur?
Keep innovating.
No, but I mean, as you watched that, was that frustrating? Was that upsetting? Did you say to yourself, we're not moving fast enough? We didn't appreciate that this could possibly happen? I mean, I'm sort of curious when you look at Instagram, which I think actually is ultimately a different product than people appreciate relative to Snap, but what did you say to yourself?
I think if we could do it over again in hindsight, we probably would have done more to communicate, as you said, how Snap is so different. Because I think that the most dangerous thing is that for people who haven't experienced Snapchat yet, if they believe they're getting the Snapchat experience on Instagram, they're less likely to go and try that experience on Snapchat. And I think what people are experiencing on Instagram is they don't feel good about themselves. It feels terrible. They have to compete for popularity. And so the idea that Snapchat is similar to that, people would be like, oh my God, that sounds terrible. And so I think we need to do a better job communicating that actually Snapchat's really different. It makes you feel good about yourself. It's an amazing way to communicate visually with your close friends and family. And I think if we could go back in time, we'd do a much better job communicating that faster and more widely than we had. The founders of Instagram just left Facebook. Would you guys ever go for a beer? Yeah, of course. Okay. Evan Spiegel, everybody, thank you. I appreciate it.